Welcome to episode 6 of What Do You Think Utah, our series of monthly discussions about issues that affect the people who live here in our pretty great state. Tonight, give us back our land, throwing the feds out of Utah. We have a distinguished panel here that I'll introduce in just a second. But first I want to do a little bit of an intro. It's a little bit of a history lesson, and some of it I may get wrong, and these people I'm sure will correct me. But 2 years before it became a state in 1896, the territorial government of Utah signed an agreement with the federal government, the Enabling Act of 1894. And this is an act that many states, or all states, I guess, signed before they became states. This allowed the people of Utah to form a constitution and state government and admission to the Union with several stipulations. Among them, quote, that the people inhabiting said state do agree and declare that they forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands lying within the boundaries thereof, end quote. The Enabling Act says that Utah is entitled to specific school trust lands, but that's all the public land you get. Utah agrees, Utah becomes a state. Today, about 67% of Utah land is managed by the federal government. That's some 35 million acres managed by 5 different agencies. The BLM, Pat Shea here, who you'll meet in a moment, was at one time the director of the BLM, the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, the Department of Defense, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. Almost as soon as we became a state, discussions began about how Utah could take more control of the land within its borders. For instance, Governor George Dern in the late 1920s to early 30s argued that mineral rights on federal land in Utah, we ought to have more control over that. He said we have to maintain the land with roads and fire breaks, and we have to take care of things. And he said when we get none of the benefits from that land, we ought to be able to drill and take minerals and oil out of that land, and we should use that money that we get from those minerals for education, he said. It should also be noted that Governor Dern made his fortune in the mining business. He worked with his father. They had a gold mining business. The 1970s saw the rise of the environmental movement and the passage of the Federal Land Policy Management Act. Is that what it was called?
Flip.
Which restated that all remaining public domain land would remain in federal ownership. Well, Western conservative politicians, along with farmers and ranchers here, didn't take that very well, and the Sagebrush Rebellion was born with a big push to claim federal land here in the West. But the Sagebrush Rebellion faded when more conservative politicians were elected nationally and also regionally. And it was thought that perhaps they would look at land issues. And apparently there were things in the Federal Land Policy Management Act that they thought would help reclaim some of the land, the federal land in the western states. Well, it didn't seem to happen. And here we are again with a big push by conservative legislators and farmers and ranchers to again try to reclaim federal land, or try to get federal land turned back to the states. Now I'd like to introduce our guests here tonight. It was difficult to pare down their careers into one paragraph. So if you want to know more about their histories, you really need to Google them. Not Dave and Bruce. They don't really have.
They're unimportant.
But Mike Noel was born in Ogden. He received his bachelor's degree at UC Berkeley and a master's degree at South Dakota, at the University of South Dakota. While working on a PhD at Utah State in 1975, Mike took a little break and went down to visit some family in Kanab. And if you've never been to Kanab, it is a beautiful part of the state. He ended up, I guess, liking it a lot. Bought a place called Bowman's Mercantile Store, which he converted into the Kanab Fountain Restaurant. Mike ran the business for 5 years, shut it down during the winters, and worked for the BLM. That later turned into a permanent position. Then in the 1980s, or in 1980, Mike traded the restaurant for a down payment on a farm. In 1997, Mike resigned from the BLM and started a private consulting management firm. In 1999, he organized People for the USA chapters in Kane and Garfield counties to help counter the political alliance between big government, wealthy foundations, and the big environmental organizations. Mike believes that this Green Alliance and the unrelenting assault on rural communities is a serious threat to the livelihood of farmers, ranchers, small business property owners, and the overall economic stability of rural America. Representative Noel was elected in what year?
This is my 13th year, 14th term next year, so.
14th year serving in the Utah.
14th year, yeah, 7th term. Yeah.
7th term in the Utah
Whatever
State.
that was, 2003, I guess.
Utah State Legislature, yeah, 2003. Next, Pat Shea. Patrick Shea is a Utah native. His academic background includes a BA from Stanford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar and student body president. He has an MA from Oxford University, a law degree from Harvard, served on a graduation school committee at Yale. He began his legal career in 1976 and has worked on many important cases, including the defense of Tim DeChristopher, aka Bidder Number 70. He still maintains bar membership in the District of Columbia and Utah, is admitted to practice before the 10th Circuit Federal Court of Appeals and the United States Supreme Court. Mr. Shea's political career in Washington, D.C. began in 1975 as assistant to the staff director of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Operations. He was counsel on the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee. President Bill Clinton named him to the President's Commission on Aviation and Security. And 1 year later, and that was in '96, a year later, he was named to the National Director of the Bureau of Land Management in 1999. Shea was named Deputy Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals. Dave Owen, you know, political consultant, specializing in media relations. Dave typically works in support of lobbying and campaign teams. He has ghostwritten dozens of opinion pieces on a variety of public policy issues that have appeared locally, regionally, and nationally. He's very good at taking complex political issues and dumbing them down for people like me. He's also managed successful campaigns. He worked directly with former Governor Mike Leavitt. And Bruce Baird, prominent real estate and litigation attorney here in Salt Lake. He's been politically active for several years in the Democratic Party as a candidate for the United States Congress and also for the United States Senate. I guess it should be noted he never served.
As a Democrat, that's true.
Yeah, he also managed and been on the senior staff of campaigns for Senate, Governor, U.S. House of Representatives, Salt Lake Mayor, Salt Lake County Commission, and other elected offices. He's written many columns and articles and been a talking head on a lot of TV shows and panels and discussion groups. Thank you all for being here. Thank you particularly Representative Noel. He drove 6 hours from Kanab to be here tonight, and
Thank you.
thanks so much for doing that. I really
bet.
appreciate
You
it.
bet.
And I want to start with a question for you, Representative Noel. What is it that you want?
I think what I want is I want to be able to stabilize the economy in rural Utah and in Utah as a whole. I want to have more control over our destiny. I want to go back to where the states are sovereign and not the federal government. I believe we created the states under the Constitution. The powers of the states are many. The powers of the federal government are limited, and I think we've gotten out of that. You know, I hear words like liberal thrown around. When I lived in New York City back in the 60s, lived on Staten Island. By the way, my hero died yesterday, Yogi Berra. That was in my time when Yogi. So this is deja vu all over again. But anyway, a liberal was someone that was a thinker that could really open up to lots of new ideas. A lot of my kids today, I wouldn't say most of my kids are Republican, but some of them are more of a libertarian. They want the government to get out of our lives. I think that's what I want too. I believe I want to have it more local control, more state control. We will never ever see the full benefit of these lands the taking care of these lands, protecting these lands, and put them to the beneficial use that they should be. I believe that's multiple use, as it was under FLPMA that you mentioned. We will never see that unless we have control over those lands. That's what FLPMA was supposed to do. By the way, you kind of made the connection between Governor Dern and the mineral industry. Governor Dern was a placer miner. That's the same exact law that exists today in 1866. You go out, you find the minerals, you produce, you own the land. So it had nothing to do with the mineral development, which was part of an energy development, and it were the coal resources at that time that were withdrawn to be able to protect those resources, because at one time they were locatable. So that's an issue on there that we probably ought to leave out. That Dern didn't do that for his own personal benefit. He did it to make sure that we in Utah had some benefits. It's interesting now today that the state of Utah shares in those lease funds. They come back to the state. They go to the trust lands. So that's a big deal for the state of Utah, hundreds of millions of dollars.
Well, so what you're, is it symbolic to you that that if we gain control of the federal lands, that somehow we become more sovereign and more independent, or is it a real benefit?
I think what's happened, Bill, is that had the federal government, had the agency that Mr. Shea headed up back in 1999 or 97, whatever it was, had they stuck to the Federal Land Policy Management Act. You asked in this little break here, why did the Federal Land Policy Management Act, why were people, what happened? Why are we so still adamant about it? Because the many promises and promises that were made to the sagebrush rebels, to those legislators and Western legislators of that time, have been basically thrown under the bus. The fact that grazing was going to be maintained at certain levels. The fact that oil and gas and minerals would be able to be developed. You know, people say, well, gee, we need to cut this land out because it's this kind of land. We need to have this leave that alone. Well, we can go in and we can develop minerals miles and miles away. You can hit a spot in a mineral find 4 or 5 miles away, and you leave there and you rehab that, and it's just like it was before. I can show you 300, 400, 500 drill test holes on the Kaparawetz Plateau that 40 years ago, you can't even find those holes anymore. So it can be reclaimed, it can be used.
I'm going to ask you specifically again, though, what you want, and I want Pat Shea to talk about that Federal Land Policy Management Act. But specifically, so do you want every bit of land that the federal government controls now in the state of Utah to be turned over to state control?
Yes, not except for the parks and the national monument areas, except for the Grand Staircase. We want that back. We thought that was totally illegal.
You want the Grand Staircase?
Absolutely, yes,
back?
absolutely.
That Bill Clinton.
That's kind of started this whole movement, was the Grand Staircase, because you know, you use the 1926 law, the Antiquities Act, the smallest amount of land to protect the antiquities, and you go put 1.9 million acres.
So you don't want the national parks back?
No, absolutely
you want
not.
all the BLM land, all the national forests.
National forest, right? Those are very important to the state of Utah.
All wilderness.
Yeah. Now the reason the forest, let me just tell you, because this is a little depth. The reason the forests are so important to us is because that's where all our water comes from. Those are our watersheds. Okay. And when the Forest Service allows trees to die and burn down, that ruins our watershed, Bill. They are a terrible manager to these lands. And I don't blame all the people on the ground. I blame the fact that we, the federal government, and you know it and everybody out here knows it, is absolutely, the Congress of the United States cannot work because of the NGOs and the way we've set this up, because attorneys can sue and stop, because individuals can stop with a one postage stamp. Okay. That's the reason.
All right. Okay. So now I think we see exactly what you want and where you're coming from.
Exactly.
Now I want to know from Pat Shea. Talk a little bit about that national that land policy and why he feels that the Sagebrush Rebellion was thrown under the bus, if that's justified. And then I want you to address a little bit about if what he's asking for is feasible.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that really beginning in 1970 with the Clean Air Act through, I would say, 1976 with FLPMA, And I think that's the best way to refer to it. I think it's important to note that policy precedes management. The idea of the legislators in Congress in 1976 was, let's establish some policies. And I agree with Mike. The policy was to have multiple use, to have some thoughtful kind of exchanges. Governor Babbitt certainly did that in Arizona.
Bruce Baird in Arizona.
And Governor Matheson here had a project called Project Bold. And he wanted, as Governor Babbitt had done, to trade federal and state land so you could consolidate. What we have now is this crazy checkerboard system of school trust lands, state trust lands, and then the federal lands. And we need to come up with a rational way. I think the practical way would be to allow the federal government to take the lands that are 10 miles from the center line of any major river and the drainage systems that go through Utah, and then allow the state to have the other lands that were excluding the national parks, national monuments, and the congressionally mandated wilderness areas. That would allow for a better consolidation. But unlike Arizona or unlike Colorado, Utah chose not to do that. We sometimes, I think, are mesmerized by this notion that we are Zion and therefore we are different and therefore we should not compromise. Politics to me is about compromise. It's coming up with areas where there are strong disagreements, but on a practical basis we move forward. And we've tried to do that several times, and each time the belligerency of some members of the House or Senate or the governor's office have played what I think is the fundamental theme of the Sagebrush Rebellion, and that is fear, fear, fear. Fear makes things come together momentarily, but it's not a sustainable coalition. So one of the things I would suggest as to why Sagebrush Rebellion 1 failed was FLTMA was there. There were political leaders at the state level who took advantage of it, didn't succumb to the political advantage of creating fear amongst their constituency, and they moved forward. There were other politicians, and I would suggest that we now, because of the money in politics, have more of them in the West than we've ever had before. And so the drumbeat of fear is the drumbeat that we hear. And the greatest thing that I worry about, quite frankly, is Utah is now the 50th state in the number of people who actually vote. So we're losing, with all this noise and all the drumbeating about fear, a belief, particularly amongst younger people, that the system actually operates.
I see Mike Noel's face getting kind of cloudy. That's
because I'm tired.
I want to give Bruce and Dave a chance to weigh in on any of this.
Well, the simple fact is if you look at southern Utah and you look at the Utah economy as a whole, the state is booming. So you can't say that the federal ownership of the land is the end of the world as we know it. You can argue, I think the key comes down to is what's the best use. I mean, Representative Noel believes that basically wide open use of the federal lands is better. There's a large number of people who don't believe that. I don't believe that. I don't believe, and I think the statistics will show that Utah can't properly manage that vast amount of property without selling it off, and you can't sell parts of it off without selling off some of the crown jewels. I mean, I'm not going to argue that the federal management system is perfect. Nobody can argue about that. The one thing I'm sure we can agree on is that Congress is as dysfunctional as you can possibly get, and you're not going to get this problem solved through Congress, which is where it should be solved on a rational policy basis because of the extremism that Pat talked about. But the litigation and the other efforts that the state are taking to try to sue the federal government to get the lands back, all that's doing is making lots of my fellow lawyers rich.
Dave, anything?
Well, I would encourage Bruce to listen to what Mike was saying. I mean, part of what he was saying is the subject of concerts given around the country by Willie Nelson and John Cougar Mellencamp, which is basically farm aid and preserving a certain quality of life in rural America. Is that not true, Mike?
That's part of it.
one
What does
your
preserving quality of
concerns.
life in rural
So the
America have
fact
to do
that
with keeping
Utah is
federal land?
booming with tech
Nothing.
firms in Utah County is of little comfort to the people who
That doesn't have a thing to do with federal lands.
from the land. Well, it does. I see both sides of it. I think certainly I want to see a lot of the lands that we're talking about preserved, but I also see the side of the people of southern Utah, in particular rural Utah, where extractive industries could be significant. I think the biggest thing that I've noticed is that what we're doing doesn't really make a lot of sense to me.
Extractive industries don't bring in jobs. Extractive industries bring in massive amounts of capital, but very few jobs given modern technology. If you take a look,
Oh, but we're also talking grazing and timber and a number of other things.
you've got grazing and timber now. You're not explaining what getting the
Bruce,
lands
I guess
back
what I'm
will
saying
solve
is,
the problem.
to me, what it
Or what the
seems
problem
that
is.
what we're doing doesn't make a lot of sense. And I have the luxury of being completely uninformed on this issue. I don't actually have to be an expert. We've got experts here. But when I look at it from a distance, just as a voter, I just say what we're doing doesn't make sense. Last year, I did have some involvement working with the Pew Foundation and support of the Public Lands Initiative that Representatives Bishop and Chaffetz are doing. It was the first time I really became acquainted with sitla lands and how that really just makes no sense at all.
Those are the school trust lands.
Yeah, these little
State
checkerboards,
institutional trust lands
which are
administration.
where the benefit is supposed to accrue to the children of the state of Utah, which certainly seems like a worthy goal to me.
Yeah.
And it just seems that cooler heads could prevail. I don't know. It seems to me like there's a solution that can be
The
arrived at.
state, by definition, owns those trust lands. So let's keep Sitla out of the federal government issue because the state already owns them and manages them
let me-
in a fiduciary
They're not-
relationship.
they're not
We're gonna get too far
contiguous.
afield
I understand
here.
that.
We're going to get too far afield here for saying. Let me just say, by the way, if some of you seem to be going and taking a side here, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, you can go to the microphone and please do. Let me go back to Pat Shea talking about attempts to compromise. And I want to direct it to you, Representative Noel.
Okay.
Pat was talking about during the Sagebrush Rebellion, he's telling the story that the federal government and Western leaders in other states and Governor Matheson here, they sat down and they wanted to try and compromise on ways to manage these lands together. And other states seemed to be able to do it, but there were some stiff necks, and there can perhaps continue to be some stiff necks here in Utah.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
I can respond.
Did I read that? Did I hear that correctly?
I think so, and that I'm not as familiar about. I think Scott Matheson was a great governor. I think he'd be a Republican today in terms of the way he was. My grandmother was a Democrat. My grandfather was a Republican, but she was a whole lot different Democrat than you see today. She was more for the people. She was a social worker. It's completely different today. It's a whole different thing. So let me just say this. First off, Bruce, I need to take you down a little tour. You've got it way wrong, okay? If in fact there was a compromise to be made, the compromise in my mind was FLIPMA. Exchanges of lands. FLIPMA allowed for the trust lands, section 2, 16, 32, and 36, to be blocked up. Now where's the trust lands today? Very, very small, really, allocation to state. We have $2 billion sitting in that trust fund right now on a very small amount. We have not had an exchange in this state for the last 10 years. And I'm going to bring this out too. Last week we were down in Grand County, and my good friend Pat defended to Christopher, said he didn't do anything wrong. When I was there, I was having a discussion with the county commissioner, and he said, well, we can't drill on these lands that are right next to the park. So I called up Kevin. I said, Kevin, please get me. Kevin is the director for the state trust lands. And I said, I want Kevin and I want Tim Donaldson, the attorney and the head over the beneficiaries, the school kids, to weigh in on this question. of when Mr. DeChristopher went in and monkey wrenched all those federal leases. Within those federal leases were 42 sections of state trust lands. The estimated value of that to the school children of Utah for that one area was $166 million. 166. So Tim didn't do anything wrong. He just cost the trust land kids $166 million and all the revenue that would come back to the state on property that's 5 miles away.
But we're mixing up issues here.
No, we're not.
Let me explain why you're mixing up the issues.
Okay.
Rationalizing the localization of school trust land is not the same thing as giving back the remainder of the property to the state.
Let me explain how you don't understand,
They're not the same thing.
They are the same
they are
thing.
not the same thing. I can certainly agree with rationalizing the state trust lands. It's silly to have them in checkerboards. That's a stupid methodology and it should be fixed. But let's assume you rationalize the state trust lands. Then you've got them in a rational situation. You still want to get all of the federal lands other than the parks turned back to the states. Those are two separate issues. One of them makes sense,
I'll tell you how they
one
make
of them
sense,
doesn't.
okay? I'll tell you how they make sense. Does the impact of what the federal government does on the federal lands impact the private lands in the state of Utah?
Well, of course it does.
Okay. So if you create a wilderness area, if you create a visual resource area, if you create those, does it impact those areas?
Of course it does.
Okay. Does the grazing lands impact the private farmers in that area?
Of course it
Okay,
does.
so when they create different rules and regulations other than what they were, it impacts a $19 billion agricultural industry. And so the feds go in and they do their thing on the land.
The issues are still separate
No, they're
between
not.
consolidation.
There's an impact there between private and federal. That's one of our biggest
You
problems.
just
I wish
want
you could
to,
see
you just
that.
want us to secede.
No,
Let Pat Shea
no.
say something about
Okay, all right.
I mean, we keep talking about the agricultural industry. I just returned from a 990-mile trip to central Utah, going to Zion's and Bryce and then to the Dolores River. And the thing that once again shocked me was how there are these huge Walmarts that have closed up all the local stores, closed up many of the local restaurants because they can't compete on that size. The same thing is happening in agriculture. These big companies, Simplot, for instance, in Idaho, others are simply running the local farmer and rancher out of the business. And if we want to do something about that, we ought to have better zoning regulations. We ought to have better regulations that promote local industry. I don't see that coming out of the legislature. When it comes to the school trust lands, New Mexico, beginning in the 1960s, was getting over $1 billion from their lands in the same checkerboard pattern. And what was Utah doing under local control, Governor Clyde at the time? It only happened when Governor Rampton and Matheson stepped in, said we have to make sure that the industries, oil, gas, and agriculture are paying fair market value. When I was BLM director and I raised the AUM, or animal unit measure, from 90 cents to $1.25, you would have thought that I was Satan amongst the ranching community, even though comparable private land was being rented at $9. So the subsidization that ranchers have been using to justify their access, I think, doesn't show free market economy. And we need to take care of that. And I think we're coming back to a time when local agriculture and the ability to tell where the food that you're eating has come from is going to make a difference. But we can't have it on the basis of fear or I'm in charge here and we're not going to have anybody else talk.
Local agriculture is going to make a difference for yuppies. Nobody else. Everybody else cares about the cheapest food you can get. And that's why the farms get big. It's a fact. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying it's a
We got to
fact.
get Bruce out of the city here. We really have to.
I spent
I
a
took
lot-
Ted Wilson
you know
down
what?
to my house, and Ted and I are on a different side of the spectrum. And he sat down, and you know what he said? He said, I have no idea why we're fighting for these roads down here. This is obviously a road. I don't understand. Mike, you would be an environmentalist. I would call you environmentalist the way you take care of your farm and your ranch and your cows. And by the way, Pat, cattle are at an all-time high in history, $1,500 per calf. Cattle are doing great. Some of the other crops are down, but that's just because we're in a worldwide market.
It's 'cause of
I ship
demand.
my hay all over the world.
Right, but
So
It's just because
but
of demand.
Let's talk
Yeah,
about.
And
let's
Mike,
talk-
I spent a bunch of time down in southern Utah, and I was raised in the West like you, Colorado, not Utah.
It's a different place now.
I understand that, but I get there frequently. The issue is we're conflating the issues between school trust. Let's assume as a given that federal management isn't perfect. All right, I mean that's a given.
Sure. It's terrible.
I won't go to terrible, but let's assume it's not
awful.
perfect. Okay, let's assume it's
more
mediumly.
carbon dioxide going in the atmosphere from one fire than we do from all the up here. It's terrible.
Let's have that as a given.
Okay.
But let's also talk about how the state
That's where I was going.
manages the land that the state has.
Pat made a great point. There were lands that were sold. I don't blame it all on one administration, Pat. I don't blame it on one party. Some of these lands were sold off. My position is, the position of the state legislature, the position of the Stewardship for Public Lands is, Utah is a public land state and it will remain a public land state. We want to make sure that happens and continue to happen. But it has to allow people of all different thought patterns to use that public lands. You guys use public lands up here all the time. You go skiing, you enjoy it, you build lifts on it, you lease it, whatever. We go to put a fence down there and we get a big no. We try to drive out on a road that we know was there in the 1800s and you say no. It's a dual hypocrisy what you do up here and you tell people in rural Utah that they can't do it down there.
Let me just correct one thing.
Okay.
We established with Ted Wilson a effort in Iron County to review all of the RS-2477 roads. And we came up with a plan where everybody could come to agreement on almost all the roads. And at the last minute, the Iron County Commission backed out of it because of the fear of the repercussions if they were seen as compromising on this wedge issue. And I said, when I came back from Washington in 2000, we're never going to win on RS-2477. We are going to spend millions of dollars. We've spent $12 million, and we are still no closer to reaching a resolution. Jim Hansen, the former congressman from the 1st District, and I, when I was BLM director, sat down, and we agreed that if we went out, we could agree, walking on the land, as to what were roads and what were not roads. But then his staff got involved, and the political people who were getting paid to give advice about how to phrase this slogan or that slogan, how to get reelected, interfered, and it stopped.
First, for the benefit of people who don't know, RS-2477 is a federal statute that says once, if it was a road before transfer, it stays a road, and it comes at questions whether it became a road under the Utah statute by being used as a public road for 10 years, and that statute's been around in Utah since the 1880s.
It doesn't have to be used for 10 years.
It's continuously for 10 years is the statute in Utah.
No, it isn't. If you construct it before 76, then it's automatically a road, okay? So let's just get that straight, because most of these roads were constructed before 76.
It depends on what you define as constructed. Most of the litigation is revolving around road by use statutes, and I'm in the middle of a case like that right now with a county where they took an aerial photograph and looked at every 2-track and said that there were literally 10,000 public roads in the county, which basically was every single thing that didn't go to a house. That anybody had ever driven on, and that's under oath. That testimony is under oath.
We can argue litigation. We're in it right now.
How does this all relate to this recapture canyon? Does this relate to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so
I'll tell you. Okay, let me give you that. And this is really interesting because this was another case Pat was involved with. What was the crux of the whole case? What was the whole crux of that case? That Mr. Lyman drove down the road.
Bill Lyman, the county commissioner.
Yeah, and he's here tonight, by the way. And he drove down a road that was shut and legally closed by the BLM. Legally closed by the BLM.
Closed by the BLM because they said
it's not an RS-2477 road.
And they closed it because they said
it was a Title V road.
And they said there are artifacts in there that we don't want people messing.
Now, if you read the closure order that came out, the closure order said the proliferation of roads off the existing roads. And if you talk to the man that actually wrote the closure order, he said we never intended for that road to be closed. Now, the key to this whole thing is this, and the public's got to understand this, okay? The prosecution, the DOJ in this case, and the BLM said there's a Title V on that road. And Phil got permission to drive down that Title V. Guess what? Now,
He
just
did
hang
not.
on.
He did
Hang
not
on.
get
Okay,
permission.
Pat, hold on.
No, but Mike, if you're going to make these
Okay,
statements,
it's
make
not-
them
okay,
truthful.
Hang on. Okay,
Make them
but Pat,
truthful.
I'll show you where you're going to be shown to be a fool tonight. Okay.
Okay.
All right. I went to the
I'm talking to
case
one, I
file,
guess.
an 1986 case file, and what does it say? There is no Title V road, Pat.
There is to
No,
the
there's not.
irrigation company.
Okay, you want to bet another
Yeah,
time?
I'll
You already
bet you.
owe me a steak dinner.
Oh.
All right. You're already from the last one. This is a $100 bet, all right?
Okay.
There is no Title V road,
Right.
$100.
But the
now, it's
And
not
I'll
on the
have-
title plats, it's not in the grant, and the grant says
And
this.
I will have John Steiger, the regional solicitor.
John
show-
Steiger, I know John. Has he ever
Good for you.
Can you read a master title plat?
Yes, I can.
Do you know the difference between
I
a
was
road and a
trained.
title plat and a
I
pipeline?
was-
The question is this.
You know, that's the
Yeah,
problem,
the
Mike.
question- all right, this is good.
Mike, you bully people, and I'm sick and tired of having you talk
question-
all the time.
The
Gentlemen.
question is this, Bill.
All right.
One would
Settle
have
down, fellas.
assumed.
All right, I apologize for bullying, okay?
One would have
I
assumed.
get upset because this guy's going to go to prison for 2 years.
Because
for
he
something-
violated the law.
He did not violate.
A jury of his peers said that he
You
did.
didn't even hear the evidence, Pat. You
One-
know it.
Now,
One would have assumed that in a federal court, if someone is represented by competent counsel, that any legal defense would have been raised and ruled on. Judge Shelby is an excellent judge. A jury convicted the commissioner. Just like Tim Christopher, I would suggest that the punishment should be similar.
And it's
You're
not 2
absolutely
years.
false.
It's-
You're both of you guys, you're absolutely nuts.
There's
Well-
a jury that convicted him in front of a United States
The
District Court
jury, my
judge.
friend, never heard the evidence
Why not?
because the judge didn't allow it to come in the case.
Because it wasn't relevant.
Oh, it wasn't relevant. Yeah, the road was a
What-
Title V road. It wasn't relevant, right? You guys, I'm up here with a bunch of guys who don't know anything about public land law. Absolutely don't even know it.
Apparently,
I happen
why-
to
if you
agree
wanna
with the
come up to
federal
microphone,
judge.
Come up to the microphone. If you want to make,
I know more
If you
about
wanna
public
make
land laws
comments.
than you'll ever, that I've forgot more about than you'll ever know, Counselor. Guaranteed.
Representative Noel, let's move on to talking about. Let's talk about. Now, I know that you're very passionate about defending your friend Phil Lyman, and if Mr. Lyman would like to come up to the microphone, he can.
I'm passionate about defending the law, the rule of
The
law.
law as you
the
understand
law-
it. It's
The law
just,
as it
it's
is on the
just-
books.
It's just like the clerk in Kentucky
No,
who
it's
said,
nothing
I
to
get
do
to
with that.
interpret the law the
Nothing
way
to do
I
with
want
that,
it.
Pat.
And
You're
if
going
it's
way
wrong,
off base.
well, excuse me, that's what you're doing, Mike.
nothing to do-
Show
What?
me a single precedent.
If
Pat,
is the case,
it's in our
has the
motion for a
case-
new trial.
has-
Go read it, okay?
Well, then you
Ours,
still,
or you're an attorney
You
now?
damn right I'm an attorney.
You still
And
have-
I can defend
you
him and I can
still-
defend everybody, okay?
you
That's-
still,
that's fought in my district.
excuse me, you still have recourse. You still have recourse, and your Commissioner Lyman, is that right?
Yes.
Can we get the microphone hot there? How are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
You probably don't feel too good with the prospect that you may go to prison.
Well-
Yes, go ahead.
No, I don't feel too good with that.
Yeah,
You're correct about
yeah.
that. That's
Nice to see you.
a
Thanks for
frightening
coming, by
prospect.
the way.
Well, I'm interested in the discussion, and I'm always interested when things are thrown out by people who think that they understand something that they don't seem to understand. And for someone to say that Phil Lyman absolutely did not have permission, number one, I didn't need permission because it's a county road. Number two, I wanted to make sure with the other interest holders down there, the Water Conservancy District, that they were okay with us using that road, which they were. I want to make sure with the state BLM director that he was okay with where we were going on that road. He absolutely was. None of that was allowed to come up in the court. And I'm sorry, Pat, but that was the
I
case.
talked to Juan Palma yesterday. He testified in court that he did not give you permission. That was what the testimony in court was.
Was that the testimony he gave in court?
He kind of backpedaled on that testimony in court. He did backpedal on it because there was a telephone conversation where he gave permission. So when that was brought up, then
Can I ask you, Commissioner Lyman,
Doesn't matter.
and can I ask you, Representative Noel, and I don't want this to be an argument with Pat Shea. I want to know why this particular moment in time was so important to you and to you.
Why was to me?
Yeah.
Because
First of all, you weren't there.
No, I wasn't there.
Why was it so important for you to do that on that day?
well, I hate to I hate to interrupt this good discussion.
Please.
If you're asking,
it needs a break.
if you're asking, if you're asking me the question,
Yeah.
why was it so important? I've said from the beginning, this was not about recapture. Recapture is symbolic. In 2009, we had 140 federal agents storm the city of Blanding in full SWAT gear, dragging people out of their houses with wrist irons and leg irons in their underwear in the wee hours of the morning onto their front lawns because somebody thought that there was some artifacts dealings going on. Most of those people were acquitted. It was heavy-handed. It was harsh. They turned around, and now they've got this story from that two other people from Blanding were prosecuted, pled to a misdemeanor for constructing a road in 2005, which has been there for over 100 years. It's my great-grandfather's road. I'm from there. I'm fourth generation Blanding. So we see this constant eating away of the culture, of the people, and the willingness to press criminal charges against people who have not broken the law. And the thing that was troubling about my case at the court level was the affiliation that the Judge Shelby, and I respect the federal judges, and I would never put myself in a position to judge them, and I love the judicial system. It's the best thing that we have. But when he recused, it was because of a conflict that he had because of an association with...
No,
That's
not true. It was because it was he wanted to avoid the perception of impropriety.
Yeah,
That's a
that's
completely
right.
different thing than acknowledging a conflict of interest.
No, he just said, I don't want any...
But that's what the law says.
He
But
recused.
Noel,
that 10th Circuit, that's
It's
the
not
rule.
the
not-
law,
no.
it's the code of professional responsibility for the judiciary.
Look,
so-
And Mike, I looked up your name in the
but-
Utah State Bar and I didn't see it there.
Hey, Pat,
let's-
listen.
But that was the
Bill,
point.
let me say one thing if I can.
Wow.
Excuse me.
First of
What
all,
an elitist.
Commissioner Lyman is part of a great tradition from Gandhi to Martin Luther King, et cetera, of standing up for what you believe in and be willing to go to jail. Now, I happen to disagree with him on what he did, but if you're going to basically say I'm defying the law, and that's all...
Which I never said.
If you're going to be running the risk of defying the law and doing civil disobedience, peaceful disobedience, which is what he did, then you got to be willing to face the consequences. Now,
Which I did not do. I did not.
There are
I did not ever
consequences
say
for
that.
all the trial. Look, and there's a process. If he's acquitted, if there's a decision by the 10th Circuit that the evidence was wrongfully excluded, then we have due process of law. If he was convicted properly, then he's going to pay the penalty for his principles.
Hold on now.
That's the American
Hang on.
way.
Hang on. If you have something you want to say.
No, I understand. Sorry, Bill.
Yeah.
If you
If you have something...
I was asking about civil disobedience. You really think you didn't do civil disobedience?
No, here's the thing.
I would like to hear you explain.
Never did.
Because I heard media reports. I read
If you would like me to explain,
let me hang on. Let me keep control of what's going on here, please.
Yeah, that's not going to show up on the mic.
Yeah.
The gentleman in the audience it sounds as though what you did was civil disobedience. It does sound that way. to
And that's
me.
what I said.
It sounds as though it was civil disobedience. You're saying no, and Representative
Okay, so
Noel is saying it's not civil
22 years I spent working on rights-of-ways. I issued the first rights-of-ways in Kane and Garfield County. I know rights-of-ways. When you put a right-of-way down in a Title V right-of-way, it goes on a master title plat. It's a double hatch line that goes down there. When you put a pipeline, it's a single line with two little bars on it. You go to the title plats in the Utah State Office, you will see no road. You go to the file, it says you will not see the roads on the master title plats because they were granted under repealed RS 2477. Road C-5314 was on, that's the road he drove on. He could neither stop anyone from going down that road, and the federal government couldn't stop him, and they didn't close that road under that order. I talked to the gentleman that wrote that order. It was never part of the order. This guy went on a road that has been bladed, that's been used for years and years and years, since 1981. How could he destroy any artifacts? He didn't destroy one artifact.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, and then I want to leave this.
Okay, great.
Getting pretty.
He's going to owe me $100.
It's
so
interesting
that's
to
dead serious, he
me
is. I'm taking
that
this one.
when people want to selectively take something out from history, they pick something like the terrible tragedy of the Reds, of what went on with an overreaction on the part of the federal government. I don't have any disagreement with that. But take your
Excuse me. What
Dr.
That's
Red.
the blanding
what Pat Shea is talking about, for those of you, do you all know the blanding case? The Reds, they had artifacts in their possession, apparently legally or illegally, but that's.
And I just 2 years ago stopped a raid that was supposed to go on in near Escalante because they had overpowered it. But part of the reason that happens, Phil, is what was happening with Clive Bundy. I was the first BLM director to sue him for failing to pay his fees for his grazing permit. And the frenzy and the danger that that created for federal employees is simply unacceptable. So I think you have to be more complete in your description of why you had the rally, why you moved your ATV through the area, and I do believe that Mike will owe me $100, but that's something that will have to be decided later. And also, I think it's important. I think it's almost important. The misdemeanor that you're facing is a 1-year sentence. Not going to get. It's a misdemeanor.
Good. Best of luck to you. Thanks for coming up. Yeah, did you want to say one more thing?
Could I just say one thing?
Yeah.
I mean, I stopped at a certain point on that road, and the reason I stopped is because that's as far as I felt that day that I wanted to take that. It was also the point where Juan Palma said, that would be wonderful. If it's as you described, then have your ride, walk or ride down in the canyon, have your celebration. That's what we did. On the phone, he said, what can I do so that we don't end up with illegal action down there? I said, I think you've done it. The threats of criminal and civil penalties to people, that resonates with them. Nobody wants to break the law. This is where we're county road. He said that would be wonderful. That was the point. And so I do want to say, just sorry, one more thing. It's not fair to compare me to Tim DeChristopher. It's not fair to Tim DeChristopher. He did take that big stand. I applaud his conviction for doing that. It was not ever my purpose. I'm a county commissioner. This is a county road. This isn't a personal issue to me. I'm not trying to save the planet. It's a few miles of dirt road. I have an obligation as a county commissioner to go out and assert the rights of the county, which is what I did. So.
Thank you.
And just for a point of clarification, Tim actually had the money to be able to pay the 10% necessary at the oil and gas auction, but the Bush administration in the waning days before the inauguration would not let us pay that money. So, again, if I were in the Mike Noel mode, we'd be yelling before the trial, he didn't break the law, he didn't break the law. Tim did not want it that way, and I would suggest that that's a good way of looking at it.
Have any questions, please feel free to.
Can I ask a question, Bill?
Yeah.
For Representative Noel, what do you think of the Public Initiative process that the two congressmen are pursuing?
What do I think? I think the Public Lands Initiative is going to go down the same route that all these other ones have gone down. That we establish certain areas and we say let's give an example. What's the last pass? The Bennett bill, right? The Bennett bill
in Washington County.
The county commissioners were adamant that was the best thing for them to do. Put up these for the Lake Powell pipeline, make sure they had access. Go talk to those commissioners. Total backsliding.
So you think politically, local pressure?
The resource management plan shuts down their water rights. It just changed the law. Congress said something. The BLM agency go in and write a new resource management plan that takes.
So the question is, do you support the PLI or not?
I don't support the PLI. No.
Because and don't support it is because that leaves some lands in federal control beyond your beyond position that every should come back to the states except the national parks and the national monuments minus grant.
State of Utah, Bruce, can manage these lands better in a way as public and do like we're the best managed state in the nation. And yeah, we job growth. You don't have job growth, we don't. We're losing our because there just aren't the jobs down there.
It's because they want to the city. Everybody else in the world wants to move to the city.
Do you think that's because?
I didn't hear that, Bruce. What was that?
Said that's because people want to move to the way they are over the wall.
They live down there and they have jobs.
But you
then you just move your state.
My son has a job, but he has to travel all over the South.
Your ignorance is showing.
But you think that the reason down there is because you can't control.
That is part of it. Bruce says there's impact.
I never, absolutely not. Not even. And I said I agree. Of course, it has impact.
Let's just go private lands. Okay. One example. Power plant. It was a power plant for Garcane Power. It had been going for 50 years. It's $1 million. generate power. The Forest Service came in and said, we're not going to do that. Colorado cutthroat trout, which we grow by the ton. It's a beautiful fishery, wanted it. They said no, took out a big percentage of the water, put it down in old channel instead of in the penstock, dries up, and so we got a lawsuit, filed it, and the state engineer ruled in favor, okay?
Anecdotal evidence proves that stupidity exists.
Anecdotal is absolutely paramount throughout the agency.
It doesn't of the logic of your argument. You're taking one bad example, hundreds of them. Everybody will agree with that, but that doesn't mean there's not hundreds or wouldn't be hundreds.
Example, would you? Example.
Well, forests away.
I like the national. You can't love the national
Well,
forest.
actually, you probably
I
you probably let some of them.
I mean,
don't.
I guess it becomes when we have if the federal government has no say in any of this, and then we have these forest fires every year, where do we get the money to fight them? The federal government's just going to say, well, we're not going to.
Same place you got the money to fight Katrina and Sandy. It comes back from the federal government.
No, I can answer that. You want me to answer that?
Yeah.
You do it through forest management, like we've done for 1,000 years. For 100 years here in this country. You go in and you cut trees, you trim trees, you have fire breaks in those areas there, and then when you do get a fire, you can actually take a bulldozer in there and build a fire line, not have a district ranger say, you can't drive in there because there's a threatened and dangerous species in that area. And so you let the whole damn forest
You're
burn
mixing
down.
issues again.
We have a question here. Yeah.
I have a question for Senate, for the Representative Noel. Actually, two. Which is the model that you think, you say that the federal government doesn't do a good job managing the lands.
Well, I can't hear her.
We can't hear you.
I can't hear you.
No,
No,
just
it's
talk
talking to the
loud
mic.
and,
Yeah.
Here? Better?
yeah.
So for Representative Noel, you say that the federal government doesn't manage the lands properly.
Yes.
What is the state model that you propose that is better than the federal government? And second, how would you secure, you talk about development and mining and oil and gas and forests, but there's no wildlife associated, no wildlife management associated. What is the management you propose and how the state will protect that?
I 100% support wildlife management. There's no question about it. I've been a bird watcher I ran the Audubon bird count for 15 years in Kanab. I love it. And I appreciate that. It doesn't do any good to burn up all the sagebrush. It doesn't do any good to burn up all the forest. That just kills all the wildlife. So the management I propose actually goes back to FLTMA. It goes back to some of the basic premises of FLTMA. Multiple use and sustained yield. That's what we need to do. That's how we need to manage these lands. We can do it. We can do it better than the federal government because the people in that area support it. And the people in this state will support it. And there'll be more money for schools. That's one of the problems we got. We say we're doing wonderful here, Bruce. You need to come up and do the budget. We're the last in the nation for funding for schools.
You're not going to hear an argument with me about how crappy
you want to tax people more.
Just you're not. I try not to interrupt you.
Okay.
You're not going to hear an argument from me that you and the legislature do a crappy job of funding the education system. It's horrid, and certainly SITLA can help if it's managed right. I have a good friend of mine who's a lawyer at SITLA, and they've gotten a lot better over the course of the last several years at managing how they do it. But just selling off all of the, and look, I'm a development lawyer. I make my money off of people developing lands. I represent a large number of the big developers in the state. But there's a big difference between developing out in Harriman and South Jordan and developing on the top of a priceless national treasure. Now, should some of that land?
Who's suggesting
just let me finish.
that?
Just let somebody finish a sentence instead of interrupting. David, I was about to say there is certainly no doubt that not all of the lands that are currently held by the federal government need to be held by the federal government, nor are they perfectly managed, nor are they necessary to preserve the environment. We can agree on that.
Right.
The difference is you want them all back, and I want to figure out, like Pat says, a rational way to deal with it. And the problem is that there's no rational way to deal with it because litigation is a meat axe, and legislation is ruined by the fact that people won't compromise.
And if I could just add
Good point.
something
Yeah,
here.
please,
To me, it comes back to the ability to compromise. And I have not seen Mike Noel be willing, or his legislative colleagues, to be able to compromise. Instead, and the Draper move of the prison is a great example, There are presently members of the Utah Senate who are going to make a huge amount of money either because of the movement of the prison west of the airport or because they have purchased in Sandy and other places where UTA is going to have to build sites, the property there, and have used, in my judgment, their legislative influence to keep things moving in that direction. I have not said anything about how our Attorney General's office seems not to be a great example of good management, or just last week, the head of the DUI unit for the Utah Highway Patrol.
We're getting far afield here.
Well, no, but they, if we're going to talk about management, we didn't have any indictments when I was director of BLM. We don't have any indictments presently in the Department of Justice. How many indictments have we had in the state of Utah for elected or public officials?
We have a question here. Go ahead, get really close to the mic.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, quickly.
My name is Paul Shea. I'm just a young man in this lovable state. I just have a quick question for pretty much anyone. Why are private companies allowed to claw profits away from public lands and then run like hell, leaving behind toxic waste to be cleaned up at the taxpayer's expense?
Do you have an example?
I mean, plenty of times with fracking in particular, you just kind of turn on these websites on YouTube and you see that someone can light their own faucet on fire with the chemicals that are traveling through the local groundwater. Yeah, and it's just a simple question.
I don't know. Is that
Well,
answer?
I don't know if that's true. I don't think that's true, but whatever.
Well, first of all, there's laws against that. The question is whether they're enforced, and the laws have evolved over time to get much more strict to prevent that. They're not perfectly done. People don't comply with them, just like people don't comply with the laws against murder and everything else. What you're talking about is a matter of enforcement, and I think, frankly, that it's badly done at the federal level on those things, and it would probably be done worse at the state level on those things.
And maybe we're smarter about it now than we used to.
We certainly are. The regulation is evolving. It's not perfect. It's not right. We're going to agree on a whole bunch of things, Mike, if you just let me agree with you.
Okay. Well,
but it just needs to be done right, and we need to have some compromise to make it done right, and we need to have some intelligence in it, as opposed to either side simply saying, I'm right, I'm taking my football and I'm going home.
Could we, we're just going to run out of time here, but I would like to, I wonder if there is not some way that you would ever say, isn't there some way that you would ever come to a position, Representative Noel, that you could say, we could sit down with federal land managers and work with them on a local level and say, this is the way, see we live here, and this is the way we've done it for a long time. Can we come to compromises about how to manage the land?
Have you ever had any dealings with the federal government? That certainly is not my experience.
I've had bad dealings with the federal government, and I've had good dealings with the
The
federal
BLM is not the world's easiest agency
I'm the
to work with.
designated dumb guy here on this issue, and I'm impressed with how much the rest of the panel knows.
Well,
and I know very little technically. I just want to bring one thing up because I can understand.
Shea seems to be a perfectly reasonable person.
I understand their frustration down where Mike comes from, and I would just point out. I've often thought about this. Go look up just go Google public lands in a variety of different states. Sure. And I remember I was back doing a congressional race a few years ago in Massachusetts and driving across western Massachusetts, and I just mused to myself, what if Congress tomorrow decided to make 67% of Massachusetts federal land?
That's utterly irrelevant.
If you impose this on anybody else, it makes no sense at all. And yet you guys are arguing this.
No, we did. It
as
didn't
if
impose
makes
it. You took it that way in the 1890s. Yeah. And I'm not suggesting it should be locked in stone. The world changes, and all that land is not necessary. Nobody said all that land is necessary.
Yeah.
Pat didn't say it was all necessary. Neither did
I.
We got to wrap it up here.
Yeah, the public land laws were opened up till 1976. You could go out, and even though that, we just claim all right and title that, I don't want to get into that argument because we have excellent constitutional attorneys that understand this issue. If we win, we win. If we lose, we lose. That's okay. But there's enough people in the legislature, and Pat, I'm sorry, there's not more Pat Sheas, but You Democrats keep doing the wrong thing, and nobody gets elected. So that's a problem. I mean, it's a fact. in
Mike, these
Utah.
are the same brilliant constitutional lawyers who lost all the money defending Amendment number 3.
No, they're not. We didn't hire those guys.
We gotta go.
Okay,
Yeah,
fine.
Those are different.
We gotta go. I want to find
All
out who
right.
wins the $100. Will you let us know?
Okay, so let me just say the parameter. If you have a title problem with somebody, where's the first place you go to find out whether he owns the land or not?
I go to my favorite forensic surveyor.
You go down on the ground and you look. Who does this say this owns this property? You go to the county
Gonna run
plats,
out of
right? And you
time.
look at it, right? And if it's not on the county plats, if the right of way wasn't granted to the Water Conservancy District, there is no Title V. That was the government's main case. They withheld evidence, they withheld Brady documents, and I think they did it purposely. So we'll find that out.
All right.
He'll owe me $100.
I want to thank Representative Mike Noel, Pat Shea, Dave Owen, Bruce Baird, technical staff, Dave Peterson, Jordan Dela Cruz, everyone here at 50 West, Mike Waldvogel, John Rivera. The show is produced by Dylan Allred and Corey O'Brien. Our next show will be on Wednesday, October 28th. To find out what the subject of that show is, you will have to like What Do You Think Utah on Facebook and follow us at Think Utah on Twitter, or visit our website, thinkutah.org. Make suggestions for shows you'd like to see in the future. See you next month. Bye-bye.
That's why there's a federal appeal process.
Let me we're gonna